Good morning, Charlotte. How you doing? You well?
Yes, great. Good morning, all.
Thanks for your time. Really appreciate your book, Sugar and Slate, is uh is doing the rounds once again. And rightly so. You won an award for this book, the not any award, the World's Book of the Year award in 2004. And I just wondered when I was going through my questions and organizing my thoughts, I wondered what it means to you that, all these years later, this work is still resonating in the same kind of way.
Yes. Well, it's great. I mean, it's fabulous that there's so much interest in the book and over such a long period of time. It's been in continuous print since I wrote it all that time ago. And in some ways, Joel, it's a bit sad that these themes still resonate so loudly across the community. I mean, obviously there have been changes, but people say to me now, gosh, the things that you're raising and talking about in the book, I very much recognize as part of my life now. So yeah, it's really nice to know that, it's a book that's still relevant and contemporary in its feel, but also a little bit sad to think that, we haven't kind of moved beyond some of these issues.
I grew up in a small Welsh town amongst people with pale faces, feeling that somehow to be half Welsh and half Afro-Caribbean was always to be half of something, but never quite anything whole at all. I grew up in a world of mixed messages about belonging, about home, and about identity. How many people have come up to you over the years and they've said just that element alone is
Yeah.
their story? And
Yeah.
just connecting with that point, how has that been?
Yeah, it's really interesting because one of the pleasures of writing this book is that when I've presented it or read or talked to people about it, they've then told me their story. And, the story of kind of mixed heritage and how it's been presented in the past, very much in this kind of binary, either or kind of way without thinking about, well, actually, we don't see ourselves like that. It's not an either or choice. And what the book tries to do is make that much more complex and kind of resist that binary of, the half thing. But yeah, I think we've all contributed to that story in some way. It's a story of multiple or mixed heritage that's so familiar, much more familiar now. But actually, 20 years ago when I wrote the book, it hadn't been that much discussed, and certainly not so much discussed in Wales. And there was a story to tell in that respect about heritage and how people see themselves and their sense of belonging to a nation.
What was it like, just the journey?
I think, obviously, I'd written academic books and I'd written academically about some of the things that I discuss in the book, but I wanted the book to have reach, and particularly to have reach in terms of Wales and Welshness. I felt there was, a story that hadn't been told in that respect. I felt that there was something to say to my nation about particular kind of experience of nation. And there was something to be said about, the kind of typical representation of who's Welsh and who's not Welsh. So I always had this ambition, and that's why I set out with the task to try and point out that past and present was not as kind of monochrome as people might be thinking. That in the past, Wales had had multiple kinds of migrations, and there were all sorts of people of different heritage that made up contemporary Wales. And it was that was the main ambition of telling the story, not as a personal story really, but as a story that's about Wales and about Welshness, and which people would begin to kind of change their thinking. So that was the ambition, Joel. When I actually set out to write Sugar and Slate, and I got the idea of how I wanted to do it and some of the kinds of stories I wanted to tell in order to relay certain points. And of course, with any memoir, you're only picking out kind of incidents and stories and pictures and frames that are going to make a point or you know, have some kind of message. I did it quite in a quite straightforward way. I didn't feel so emotionally charged about it. I just felt political, if you know what I mean. But now, all these years later, when I look back or I'm asked to read passages from it, I do feel that you know, a heightened level of emotion. As you asked me about, you know, I do feel some of those highs and lows. I do feel, wasn't that sad, or you know, or wasn't that a joyous moment? So yeah, I feel the book more emotionally now than I did at the time somehow.
The whole Sudanese exposure, Guyanese exposure, North Wales exposure, that mixed together is who sits before me today, right? So I just wonder, how do you see yourself?
Yes. Well, of course, the book tells the story. My father was working in. We were living in Wales. My mum's Welsh, and from the sort of slate quarrying heritage of Wales. My father's from the sugar country in the Caribbean. But when we were little, he took up jobs in universities in Africa, first in Sudan and then later in Nigeria. So part of our small girl days, our childhood days, was this toing and froing between Wales and Africa. And then later my father returned to his home country of Guyana. And then I also described going to Guyana and sort of reconnecting with that heritage. So there's this kind of great transatlantic triangle in the book that connects, you know, Wales, UK, Africa, and the Caribbean, historically and in the contemporary sense. And in terms of, you know, identities, I think we've got a much more sophisticated understanding of the complexity of identity now and identifications, how people identify in different contexts at different times. And the way I see it is it's all of that, you know, it's a kind of complex of that you carry with you. And depending on the context you're in, some elements of your identity come more to the fore and others recede, and or some of that mix becomes more apparent in how you're connecting with certain individuals. So it's all of you, it's all of that, and you carry it with you.
As we touched on off camera, the book is currently in a very esteemed place at the moment. I believe you're one of the first authors of colour to achieve this. Is that correct?
I'll just tell you a little bit of the story. So when I wrote the book, I didn't, you know, I didn't have huge ambitions for it then. Obviously, I wanted to reach a new public, and it was published by a small Welsh publisher. Actually, it was a publisher that is known for its internationalist journal rather than its book publishing. But they had encouraged me, they'd reached out to me, and I wrote it and they published it. And as you said, it won Welsh Book of the Year in 2003. And then just around 2020, we have something in Wales called the Library of Wales series. And this is a canon of books that are seen as classic to Wales. And there aren't loads in it. And Sugar and Slate was selected to be part of this Library of Wales series and published by Parthian then. And then Bernardine Evaristo's initiative to launch a series called Black Britain Writing Back her ambition was to kind of uncover and bring to the fore and open up books that she felt had not had the exposure that they should have had at their time. And that series is well underway, and mine was one of the books that she has picked for launch this year, and it's just being launched, I think, officially. So yeah, it's a great honour. It really is a great honour that it's been picked up in that series, particularly given what that series is about. You know, it's really uncovering and revealing kind of stories that give a message to what Britain and Britishness is. So yeah, I'm very delighted, pleased with that.
As you should be, rightly so. A very big thing, very big feather in your cap, and inspiration for those coming behind you who don't feel like their voices are heard, even once it's down on paper and available for people to buy. So real inspiration. I appreciate you for that. It brings me on to my next question, really. The foreword by Hazel V. Carby. It was brilliant, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. The end, though, if I may quote, it was the cruelly driven slaves, men, women, and children who toiled and sweated for the huge sugar profits that built the industries in Wales. Out of the profits of slave labor in one empire, he, Richard Pennant, built another on near slave labor. The plantocracy sponsored the slateocracy in an ultimate web of relationships where sugar and slate were the commodities and brute force, and exploited labor were the building blocks of the Welsh Empire. This is the historical legacy that Sugar and Slate forces us to confront, and its enduring significance. If we do not act to repair historical injustice, we cannot build an equitable future. Powerful words.
Powerful. Well, one of the things that I do in the book is draw on what we could call Black History Wales. So what I wanted to get across was how Wales has been implicated just as much as, you know, the broader UK in acts of omission and acts of commission, like slavery being one. And of course, in these devolved nations, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, there's a tendency to see that past as very much British, as in England, rather than all of the four nations being involved and connected to that terrible history. And I wanted to dispel that myth of nation, if you like. So in the book, I draw on lots of little pasts of Black history to demonstrate this. And of course, the significant one to my story is that my father comes from sugar plantation history and slavery, and my mother comes from a very difficult history of exploitation of working class people, workers, in making great wealth for what we might call slate barons. And it just is so significant because just sort of around the corner from where I live is this huge mock castle, you know, that belonged to the Pennant family. And the Pennant family made their wealth from what they called their West India interests and from their local slateocracy, as Hazel refers to it there. Now, those two commodities are kind of embodied in me, and I wanted to use that to demonstrate to Wales its culpability, its historical culpability in terms of slavery and the slave trade, but also the fact that ordinary, everyday Welsh labour had contributed to this, rich kind of wealth of families like the Pennant family. So, it's it's an important history, and it's an important history for not only for Wales. And you touched on the experience of growing up in what was particularly a whitescape in North Wales. North Wales is, not a very small minority population demographically, not small in the sense of presence, but you know what I mean, relatively small. And I think for those, and you mentioned your own focus and focus of your work in London, but for us out in these rural or semi-rural parts of Britain, I think there was a story to tell, because being a Black Briton had been associated significantly with living in one of the major cities of the UK. And what we've done, those of us who've written from these far places, if you like, we've stretched out multiculturalism to an understanding that everywhere in Britain, there's historically and in a contemporary sense, there's a presence of Black people, and Black people have contributed right across the UK, irrespective of, you know, whether it's rural or urban, to what Britishness is. And I hope books like Sugar and Slate do that job of stretching out multiculturalism, telling the story of these different kinds of lived experiences that are part and parcel of every part of the UK.
What was it like meeting up with Hazel? Have you ever met her? I know obviously you've spoken, but what was that like? Because she alluded to obviously finding the text and, you know, being enamored by it and wanting to meet you. And so what was that union like and coming together?
Yeah. Well, it's absolutely fantastic because Professor Hazel Carby is such an esteemed, academic and known internationally for her contribution, and an interesting contribution that she's made both in the States and the UK. You know, generally she's like a kind of academic household name, if you know. And I met her online, and she talked about her own heritage, which is so interesting. She also has a Welsh mother, and we connected immediately because of that past that we both had. And I think she wrote, I think it was published in 2020, her book Imperial Intimacies. And that title's so clever, because what she's saying is that we've understood a lot about colonialism and the connections in terms of trade, labour, industry, economy, and so on. But she was talking about these intimacies, you know, these connections through marriage and partnership and so on, that are also part of that story. So we connected up, and it was a great session. We did a joint session on this very kind of topic for a historical society online. So yeah, that was a privilege to do.
I feel like I could talk to you for so much longer than, you know, the 20 minutes, half an hour we've been on the line. I really thank you for your time. Is there anything else about Sugar and Slate that you want to share with the audience before we part ways, apart from encouraging them to go and pick up a copy or download one, or whatever it is these days?
Right, we've talked about some very heavy themes here, but actually it's a very easy read, I think. You know, my main ambition was that people would like it, engage with it, and want to read it. And those kinds of big ideas that we've talked about in this interview, they just come through, I think, through the stories that I tell. It's more kind of in the storytelling that it prompts people to think about those kind of wider issues. So, for example, you know, the opening chapters, I'm just talking about being on that voyage as a little girl going to Africa, and what Africa, you know, how I saw Africa at the age of 6, you know, how it sort of reflected to me that I was very British, if you know what I mean. I'm also very proud of my father's work, because my father's an artist. He's died now. And very recently, his work, which is now in the permanent collection of Tate Britain, as one of the pioneers of bringing the Caribbean to the British art scene. So it's an interesting story from, and lots of scholars of my dad, Dennis Williams, have approached me about Sugar and Slate, because it tells a more personal story about somebody who's significant in terms of all our history as Caribbean people in the UK. So yeah, I just encourage people to read it, because it's light, it's not heavy, but it's got those big themes that we will all recognise.